They called it the Heritage Flotilla, and to the rest of the galaxy, it was nothing more than a floating museum. A parade of ancient, useless relics that the humans had somehow managed to keep running for centuries. We'd see them sometimes, drifting through the outer systems, their hulls scarred and patched with materials that hadn't been manufactured in 200 years. They moved slowly, ponderously, like old men taking a walk in the park. We laughed at them. We pointed and made jokes about how their engines probably ran on coal and steam. I remember the first time I saw one up close. I was stationed on a Xylorian cruiser, the Vengeful Star, and we were doing a routine patrol through the Uit cloud of a dead system. There it was, a massive, blocky thing that looked more like a city than a warship. Its hull was a patchwork of different metals, some of them rusted, some of them gleaming with a dull, worn sheen. It had these enormous, rotating sections that I later learned were for artificial gravity, a technology we'd abandoned 1,000 years ago. It was like looking at a dinosaur. You knew it had once been a fearsome predator, but now it was just a slow, lumbering giant, completely out of its time. I laughed, we all did. Our helmsman, a young zealot named Cathar, made a comment about how it looked like it was held together with human stubbornness and glue. We all chuckled. The captain, a stern Xylorian with 5 battle stars on his crest, just shook his head and ordered us to maintain distance. "Let the relics play their little games," he said. "They're not worth our time." That was the general attitude of the galaxy. The humans, or Terrans as they preferred, had once been a force to be reckoned with. But that was ancient history. They'd been a warlike race, yes. They'd fought and bled and carved out a small empire for themselves. But that was 1,000 years ago. They'd crippled themselves in some great internal conflict, and since then they'd become quaint. They had a representative on the Galactic Council, but they were largely ignored. They were the old, eccentric uncle who shows up at family gatherings, tells rambling stories about the good old days, and leaves early. We had no reason to fear them. They didn't have the advanced energy weapons we did. They didn't have our sleek biomechanical ships that could slip through slipstreams like a fish through water. They still used physical projectiles, for crying out loud. Projectiles. They fired chunks of metal at things. It was like watching someone try to fight a modern battle with a sword. We thought it was primitive. We thought it was pathetic. The day everything changed, I was on the command deck of the Vengeful Star. We were part of a large task force, the Galactic Armada, under the command of the Vexar High Command. We'd been ordered to assemble at the edge of the Terran home system, a place called Sol. There was some kind of diplomatic incident. The humans had apparently been hoarding a resource, a rare mineral used in our quantum drives, and they'd refused a request to hand over their stockpiles. It was a polite term for a demand. The Vexar, who were the dominant species in the galaxy, didn't like being told no. So we were there to show them the error of their ways. A show of force. A little flex of our collective muscle to remind the upstart humans of their place in the galactic order. Our fleet was magnificent. 30 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy. Ships that could glass a planet in a matter of hours. Ships that had been conquering worlds for millennia. We were the pinnacle of galactic evolution, and we were about to teach a lesson to a race that had been playing with fire and had gotten burned. I was a sensor officer, a Xylorian named Javek. It was my job to monitor the space around us, to track potential threats and report any anomalies. It was a boring job most of the time, especially when the enemy was as laughable as the Terrans. I remember looking at the data on my screen. The human ships were gathering just on the other side of their asteroid belt. There were about 200 of them, a ragtag fleet. Some of them were even older than the museum piece we'd seen in the Uit cloud. On the view screen they looked pathetic. They were tiny pinpricks of light moving slowly into formation. They were in some kind of archaic defensive line, like soldiers from an ancient battlefield. I could see their designators on my tactical screen. The Moskva, the Zhenghe, the Tokyo, the Unity. And then there were the ones that looked like they were built from spare parts. The Reliant, the Dauntless, the Forward unto Dawn, such poetic names for such unassuming ships. The atmosphere on the command deck was one of casual contempt. Captain Vilar, my superior, was sitting in his command chair, sipping a glass of Zillant nectar. He was reviewing the tactical data with a bored expression. "Look at them," he said, his voice amplified through the ship's intercom. "They're scrambling like a nest of startled insects. They don't even know what they're doing." A wave of laughter rippled through the crew. It was true. Their formation was sloppy. There were gaps in their line, and some of their ships were lagging behind. It looked like they'd just thrown a bunch of old ships together and hoped for the best. We'd seen their military before. It was a joke. It was a ceremonial relic of a past they could no longer embrace. "We have a communication request from the Terran flagship," a comms officer reported. "It's the Unity." Captain Vilar waved a dismissive hand. "On screen." The view screen flickered and an image appeared. It was a human. He was old. His face was lined with wrinkles and his hair was a stark, snowy white. He had a scar on his cheek, a deep, puckered mark that looked like it had been there for decades. He was wearing a simple, dark blue uniform. No medals, no elaborate decorations. He just looked tired. There was a profound weariness in his eyes, but also a glint of something else. Something I couldn't quite place. "This is Admiral Jameson of the Terran Defense Force," he said. His voice was low and gravelly. He didn't sound intimidated. He didn't sound frightened. He just sounded like a man who was about to do something he'd been dreading for a very long time. "You have entered our sovereign space. You are ordered to withdraw immediately." Captain Vilar leaned forward in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Admiral Jameson," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we are here on behalf of the Galactic Council. You have violated the Non-Proliferation Accord regarding the mineral Zilithium. You will surrender your stockpiles to us, or we will be forced to take them by force." The human didn't flinch. He just stared at the camera, his gaze unwavering. He had this unnerving stillness about him, like a statue. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of his chest. "I will say this one more time," he said, his voice still quiet. "Turn your ships around and leave. This is your only warning." The command deck erupted in laughter. His only warning, how laughable. We were the most powerful fleet in the known galaxy, and this ancient human was threatening us. I couldn't help but let out a small chuckle myself. Cathar, the helmsman, was practically slapping his console. "He's going to warn us," he cackled. "What's he going to do? Throw rocks at us?" "Admiral," Captain Vilar said, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands behind his head, "I don't think you understand the situation you're in. We have enough firepower to turn your entire fleet into cosmic dust. Your brave words are, well, they're amusing. But this is your final warning. You will stand down and order your ships to power down their engines. You are to prepare for boarding and surrender." The human on the screen slowly shook his head. There was no anger on his face, just a deep, profound sadness. "You know," he said almost to himself, "we were so hopeful once, so hopeful that you would learn, that you would see that we weren't a threat. We kept our promise, we laid down our weapons, we let the galaxy forget we were ever warriors. We thought it would be different this time. We thought," he paused, and for a moment his composure seemed to crack. "We thought we'd done enough." He looked up, and there it was. That glint in his eyes I couldn't place. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was resolve. It was the look of a man who had run out of options and was now ready to do what he had to do. "You should have listened," he said, his voice suddenly hard as steel. "You should have believed the stories." He gestured to someone off-screen, and the transmission ended. The screen went black. There was a moment of silence on the command deck. Then the laughter resumed, louder than before. "Believe the stories," Cathar snorted. "What stories?" "That they used to be tough. That was 1,000 years ago." He spun his helmsman's chair around, grinning at the rest of the crew. "What are they going to do? Tell us ghost stories?" A few people chuckled nervously, but I noticed Captain Vilar wasn't laughing. He was staring at the blank view screen with a frown on his face. He didn't like being defied. He didn't like being made to look foolish. "Helmsman," he said, his voice now sharp, "bring us into weapons range of that flagship. Let's show them what a real warship looks like." "Aye, Captain," Cathar said, turning back to his console. "Bringing us in. We'll be in range in about 30 seconds." My eyes drifted back to my sensor console. I was tracking the human fleet, watching their old, blocky ships slowly move into position. They were still in their defensive line, but there was something different about them now. Their engines were glowing brighter and their power signatures were spiking. They were powering up their weapons. "Captain," I said, my voice a little hesitant, "the human ships are charging their weapons." Captain Vilar waved his hand dismissively. "They're probably just warming up their little pop guns. Don't worry, JVEC. They don't have anything that can penetrate our shields." "Captain," I said, my eyes scanning the data, "I'm detecting a shift in their formation. The older ships, the ones we thought were museum pieces, they're moving to the front. They're forming a screen." "Let them," Vilar said. "A screen of antique metal won't stop us." He looked over at his weapons officer. "Target the Unity. Prepare a full barrage of plasma torpedoes. I want them gone in the first volley." "Yes, Captain," the weapons officer replied. "Targeting the Unity. Plasma torpedoes ready." I watched the human fleet on my screen. The old ships were definitely moving to the front, the ones we'd laughed at. The Reliant, the Dauntless, the Forward unto Dawn. They were tiny, their power signatures barely a flicker compared to the behemoths behind them. And behind them, the newer ships, the Moskva, the Zhenghe, they were doing something strange. They were powering down. Their energy signatures were fading. They were going dark. "What are they doing?" I muttered to myself. I zoomed in on the visual feed from our long-range scanners. The human ships they were transmitting something. A signal. It was a complex, encrypted pattern. It wasn't a communication. It was more like a data stream, a program of some kind. It was spreading out, flooding the local space with a repeating frequency. My console started to flicker. "What in the stars?" I said. "What is it, JVEC?" Captain Vilar asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know," I said, my fingers flying across my console. "I'm picking up a strange signal from the human fleet. It seems to be a data transfer. A virus, maybe." "A virus?" Vilar scoffed. "They're trying to hack us with a virus. That's ancient techno." He stopped mid-sentence. A low hum began to emanate from the ship. It was a deep, thrumming vibration that I could feel in my bones. The lights on the command deck flickered. Someone gasped. The hum grew louder. "Captain," the helmsman cried out, "we've lost primary power. The main engines are offline." "What?" Vilar yelled, surging to his feet. "How is that possible?" I don't know," Cathar stammered. "The systems just shut down. I'm getting a critical failure warning for the quantum core." My console was going haywire. Alarms were flashing, and red warning symbols were popping up all over my screen. The data streams from the human fleet were flooding our systems, bypassing our firewalls and shutting down our subsystems one by one. It wasn't a virus. It was a master override. They were taking control of our systems. Captain Vilar turned to me, his face pale with rage. "What is going on?" But I couldn't answer him, because at that moment the humming reached a crescendo and everything went silent. The lights went out. The hum stopped. The only sound on the command deck was the frantic beeping of backup systems and the panicked breathing of the crew. And then a new sound came over the communication system, a deep, resonant voice. It wasn't Admiral Jameson. It was someone else. It was a woman's voice, calm and steady. "This is Captain Maria Sanchez of the Terran defense ship Unity," she said. "We have successfully disabled your primary offensive and defensive systems via a quantum disruptor field. Your vessels are now inert." Inert, our mighty warships, the pride of the galactic armada, were floating dead in space. The command deck was in chaos. Some of the crew were shouting, others were running to their consoles trying to get anything to respond. I just sat there, staring at my blank screen, my mind reeling. I couldn't understand it. We were the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. How could a race of primitive, backwards humans have done this to us? But the voice on the comms wasn't finished. Admiral Jameson gave you a chance to leave, Captain Sanchez continued. You did not take it. This is not a negotiation. This is not a police action. This is an act of war. You threatened the Terran homeworld. You threatened the human race. The lights flickered back on, but they were red now, an emergency tint. I looked around the command deck. The crew were all staring at the view screen, their faces etched with confusion and fear. 300 years ago, Captain Sanchez's voice continued, we were a force of nature. We carved an empire out of the stars with our bare hands and with technology you have since forgotten. We were not kind. We were not merciful. We were effective. She paused. The silence on the command deck was absolute. I could hear someone's breath shaking. But we gave it up, she said, her voice softening just slightly. We made a choice. We chose peace. We dismantled our weapons. We buried our war machines. We let the galaxy believe we were weak. We let the galaxy forget that we were once the most fearsome predator in the cosmos. The view screen flickered to life and I saw the human fleet, but it wasn't the same. The old ships, the museum pieces, were glowing. Their hulls were shimmering with a strange energy. They weren't just ships anymore. They were weapons. Those ships you saw, Captain Sanchez said, the ones you thought belonged in a museum, they are older than your entire species, Xylorian. They were there when we fought the first galactic war. They were there when we turned the tide against the darkness. They are relics of a time when humans were not just a race. We were a storm. The view shifted, and I saw the Reliant. Its hull was now covered in protrusions that hadn't been there a moment ago. Weapons. I could see energy signatures building on its surface. The same was happening with the Dauntless and the Forward Unto Dawn. They are not here because they are beautiful, Captain Sanchez said, her voice hardening. They are here because we have kept them. We have kept them secret. We have kept them dormant. We told ourselves it was a museum, a reminder of what we once were. We told ourselves we'd never need them again. We were wrong. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was like the cold edge of a blade. You have forced our hand. You have made us remember what we are. Captain Villar was pale. He looked like he was going to be sick. He turned to face the view screen, his hands shaking. This is a bluff, he stammered. This is a trick. You can't do this. You can't. We can and we will, Captain Sanchez said. This is your last chance to surrender. Order your fleet to stand down. Power down your remaining systems and prepare to be boarded. If you resist, if you attempt to fire on us, we will do what we did to the last empire that threatened us. We will erase you from the stars. I could feel the tension on the command deck. It was like the air itself was heavy. Everyone was looking at Captain Villar. He was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Captain, I said, my voice trembling, you need to make a decision. He didn't move. It was Cathar who broke the spell. The young helmsman was staring at his screen, and I saw his eyes go wide. Captain, he said, his voice a whisper, the human ships, they're targeting us. I looked at my console. It was back on. Data was streaming in. The human ships, all of them, had their weapons locked onto us, but it wasn't just their new weapons I was seeing. It was their power readings. They were off the charts. Their old, worn-out ships were emitting power levels that dwarfed our own. Our ships were inert, but theirs were alive. They were bristling with energy, and their targeting systems were locked onto every vessel in our fleet. I knew at that moment that we had made a terrible mistake. We had poked a sleeping giant. We had laughed at a monster, and now the monster was awake. Captain, I said again, my voice now urgent. Their weapons are online. They're ready to fire. We have no shields, no engines, no weapons. We're sitting ducks. Captain Villar looked at me, his eyes glazed over. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been walking on thin ice for 1,000 years and had just heard it crack. He stumbled back to his chair and sank into it. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at the wall. Then he let out a long, weary sigh. "Open a channel," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The comms officer complied. "Admiral Jameson," Villar said, his voice hollow. "Captain Sanchez, we surrender, we surrender." The bridge erupted in a chorus of sighs and murmurs. Cathar slumped back in his chair, his face pale. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. We were alive. They had given us a chance, and we had taken it. But as I watched the human ships, their weapons still glowing and ready, I felt a profound sense of dread. They had told us who they were, and we hadn't listened. We had seen their ships as relics, as monuments to a forgotten age. We had been wrong. A message appeared on my screen. It was from Captain Sanchez. It was just a single line of text. "You will find we have long memories." And then another message, this one from Admiral Jameson. It was a simple question, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Are you ready to be remembered?" Part 2. The Unveiling. The surrender of the Galactic Armada was, without question, the most humiliating moment in the history of the Zalorian Empire. In the span of a single standard hour, our reputation, our technological superiority, and our sense of galactic dominance had been shattered. We, the mightiest fleet in the known galaxy, had been brought to our knees not by a superior force, but by a fleet of museum pieces. It was a paradox that ate at us, gnawing at our very understanding of the universe. For the next 3 days we floated in the void, our ships dead and our spirits crushed. The humans didn't board us immediately. They just sat there, watching us with their silent, glowing ships. It was a form of psychological warfare, I'm certain of it. They wanted us to stew in our own fear and confusion. They wanted us to understand the depth of our miscalculation. During those 3 days, we were permitted only essential communications. We were allowed to send a message to our high command, informing them of our surrender and of the humiliating terms. I imagine that message was received with a mixture of disbelief and panic. The Vexar High Command, a body of beings who hadn't known defeat in 5 millennia, was suddenly faced with the prospect of a war against an enemy they dismissed as primitive. I heard later that the Grand Vexar himself, a bloated creature of immense power and ego, had nearly choked on his own bile when he heard the news. But the humans didn't just leave us there to rot. On the 4th day, a signal came through. It was Admiral Jameson again. He looked tired, but there was a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "We have decided to accept your surrender," he said. "Your ships will be escorted to the 3rd planet of your home system, Xylos Prime. There, you will begin negotiations for a formal ceasefire." A formal ceasefire. It was a polite way of saying they were about to dictate terms to the Zalorian Empire. "However," the Admiral continued, "before that happens, I think it's important that you understand exactly what it is you're dealing with. You were confused by our ships. You thought they were relics. We are going to show you just how wrong you were. Prepare a shuttle. Captain Sanchez will escort a delegation from your ship to a demonstration." A demonstration. I didn't like the sound of that. None of us did, but we were in no position to refuse. Captain Villar was ordered to assemble a delegation. He chose Cathar, our Zillant helmsman, a weapons specialist named T-Vec, and myself. I was the sensor officer. I was the one who had first seen the data. I was the one who had first suspected that something was deeply wrong. Perhaps they thought I would be able to understand what we were about to see. We boarded a small shuttle, and it was piloted by 2 human soldiers. They were silent, their faces unreadable. They flew us across the divide past the human ships and towards one of the ancient vessels. It was the Forward Unto Dawn, the ship that had been the most heavily modified. As we approached it, I could see it up close for the first time. It was magnificent in a terrible, brutal sort of way. Its hull was covered in scars, testament to battles long past, but there were also new additions. Massive, bulbous turrets that swiveled with an almost predatory grace. Panels that opened and closed, revealing the gleaming muzzles of weapons I didn't recognize. The shuttle docked with the ship, and we were escorted through a series of corridors. The interior was just as bizarre as the exterior. It was a patchwork of old and new. Some corridors were narrow and grimy, the walls covered in grease and carbon scoring. Others were wide and pristine, filled with humming machinery. It was like walking through a living museum, but one that was also a functioning warship. We were led to a large observation deck. It was filled with human officers, all of them watching us with a mixture of curiosity and cold contempt. At the center of the deck stood Captain Sanchez and Admiral Jameson. The Admiral looked even more tired than he had on the view screen. He was leaning on a cane, and his movements were slow and deliberate, but his eyes were sharp, and they were fixed on us. "Welcome to the Forward Unto Dawn," Admiral Jameson said, his voice echoing in the large space. "This ship has been a part of the Terran fleet for over 400 years. She has seen more battles than your entire species has fought, Zalorian. She has been shot, bombed, and boarded. She has been crippled and repaired more times than I can count. She is not a relic. She is a survivor, and she is about to show you why." He turned to the observation window, which looked out onto the void of space. In the distance, I could see a barren, lifeless moon. It was a cold, gray rock, pockmarked with craters. It looked as unremarkable as any moon in the galaxy. "Watch," Admiral Jameson said, his voice hard. Captain Sanchez raised a hand and made a gesture. There was a low hum, and I felt the deck vibrate. Then a beam of light shot out from the Forward Unto Dawn. It wasn't a laser. It wasn't a plasma bolt. It was a solid, coherent beam of pure white light that was almost too bright to look at. It hit the moon, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the moon began to glow. A soft orange glow at first, then a brilliant white. The glow spread, covering the entire surface of the moon in seconds. And then, in a flash of blinding light that forced me to shield my eyes, the moon simply ceased to exist. I stared at the empty space where the moon had been. There was nothing left, not even a cloud of dust. It had been utterly and completely vaporized. "The Terran Annihilator Beam," Captain Sanchez said, her voice flat. "A weapon that uses pure, focused quantum energy to disintegrate matter at a molecular level. It leaves no debris, no radiation, nothing, just an empty space." I felt my legs go weak. I stumbled back, and Cathar caught me. He was just as pale as I was. Tivek, the weapons specialist, was staring open-mouthed at the empty void. His face was a mask of utter, abject terror. "That was one shot from a single ship," Admiral Jameson said. "The Forward Unto Dawn has the capacity to fire 4 such beams simultaneously. We have 32 ships in our fleet that are equipped with this weapon." 32 ships. 32 ships that could vaporize a moon in a single shot. I did the math in my head. They could glass a planet in minutes. They could sterilize a solar system in hours. "We showed you this," Captain Sanchez said, "because we want you to understand. We are not here to conquer. We are not here to enslave. We have no interest in your resources or your territory. We want to be left alone. We want to live in peace. But if you or any other species ever threaten us again, we will not hesitate to use these weapons. And we will not stop at a moon." The silence on the observation deck was absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the ship's engines and my own ragged breathing. I looked at Admiral Jameson, and I could see the weight of 1,000 years on his shoulders. He wasn't a conqueror. He was a guardian. A tired, ancient guardian who had been forced to show his fangs to a pack of arrogant predators. "Your species made a mistake," the Admiral continued, his voice low. "You mistook our silence for weakness. You mistook our patience for fear. You mistook our ships for relics. We let you believe those things because it was easier. It was safer. We didn't want to fight. We didn't want to be the monsters we once were, but we are still the Terrans. We are still the humans, and we will not be pushed around." He stepped closer to us, and his eyes bore into mine. "We will never start a war," he said. "But by all the stars that have ever burned, we will always, always finish one." A chill ran down my spine. I believed him. I believed every word he said. "We'll take you back to your ship now," Captain Sanchez said. "You have a lot to think about." We were escorted back to the shuttle, our minds reeling. The flight back to the Vengeful Star was silent. None of us spoke. Cathar stared blankly at the wall. Tivek was trembling. I just stared out the window, watching the human ships drift silently in the void. They no longer looked like relics. They looked like sleeping giants. And I had just watched one of them wake up. When we arrived back on the Vengeful Star, Captain Vilar was waiting for us in the command deck. The moment he saw our faces, his own face drained of color. "Well," he demanded, "what did you see?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't find the words. It was Cathar who finally broke the silence. "They have a weapon," he said, his voice a whisper. "A weapon that can vaporize a moon. They have 32 ships that can fire it." Captain Vilar stared at him, his eyes wide. "That's impossible," he stammered. "There's no such weapon. It defies the laws of physics. It defies everything we know about energy and matter." "There is such a weapon," I said, finally finding my voice. "We saw it, Captain. They blew up a moon, a whole moon. It's just gone." Captain Vilar sank into his chair, his face pale. He looked at the view screen at the human fleet, and I could see the fear in his eyes. It was the same fear I felt in my own heart, a fear that I had never experienced before, a fear of the unknown, a fear of an enemy we had utterly underestimated. The comm station crackled to life. It was Admiral Jameson again. "Captain Vilar," he said, "we have received word from your high command. They have agreed to our terms for a ceasefire. We will escort you to Xylos Prime to begin negotiations. We will not enter your atmosphere. We will stay in orbit, but we will be watching." He paused, and I could swear I heard a hint of something in his voice. Was it satisfaction? Or was it just a deep, weary resignation? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. "The Galactic Council has also been informed of our actions," the Admiral continued. "We have made it clear that we will not be ignored any longer. We are no longer a silent observer. We are a player, and we will play by our own rules." The transmission ended. The command deck was silent. We were all thinking the same thing. Everything had changed. The galaxy had been turned upside down. The humans, the Terrans, were no longer the quaint, eccentric race we had all laughed at. They were the sleeping giant that had finally woken up. And they were angry. I sat down at my console, my hands still shaking. I had a sudden, vivid memory of a story my great-grandfather used to tell me. It was a story about a creature that slept for 1,000 years and then woke up and devoured the world. I used to think it was just a fairy tale, a cautionary story for children. Now I realized it was a prophecy, and we were the ones who had woken the creature. I looked out the window at the human ships. They were silent and still, but I knew now that their silence was a lie. They were waiting, watching, ready to strike. We had poked the beast, and we had been lucky to escape with our lives, but the scars would remain, and the lesson would be burned into our memories forever. The humans, it turned out, were not just a race. They were a warning of what happens when you forget the past, a warning of what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, and a warning of what happens when you wake a sleeping giant. They thought those human ships belonged in a museum. Then they started firing. And now we all knew the truth. The museum was not a place for the dead. It was a place for the waiting. And the humans, it seemed, had been waiting for a very, very long time. The journey to Xylos Prime was the longest 3 days of my life. The silence on the command deck was suffocating. No one dared to speak, for fear of breaking the fragile hold we had on our sanity. We were being escorted by a full contingent of human warships. They surrounded us on all sides, their ancient hulls now appearing to me as silent, patient predators. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of one of their weapons' turrets, and my stomach would clench with fear. We arrived at Xylos Prime to find a scene of utter chaos. The news of our defeat had spread like wildfire throughout the galaxy. The Galactic Council was in an uproar. The Vexar High Command was in a state of panic. Every major species was scrambling to understand what had happened and how they could respond. I imagine there were a lot of frantic meetings and hushed whispers, a lot of finger-pointing and blame games. No one wanted to admit that they had all been wrong about the humans. No one wanted to accept that their entire worldview had been shattered. We were given a designated orbit, a safe distance from the human ships. A meeting was arranged between the Terran delegation and the Zalorian High Command. The meeting was to take place on a neutral space station, a diplomatic hub called the Convergence. It was a massive, ring-shaped structure that hung in the void between our two fleets, a symbol of our supposed unity. I was not part of the negotiating team. I was just a sensor officer. My job was done, but I was curious. I wanted to see the humans up close without the buffer of a view screen. I wanted to understand them. I wanted to see the faces of the people who had shattered our illusions. So I volunteered to be part of the security detail. It was a risky move. If anything went wrong, I would be right in the middle of it. But I didn't care. I needed to see. I needed to understand. The shuttle ride to the Convergence was tense. The human pilots were silent again, their faces unreadable. I sat in the back, my heart pounding in my chest. I was about to meet the enemy. The same enemy who had vaporized a moon with a single shot. The same enemy who had humiliated us in front of the entire galaxy. We docked at the Convergence, and I was led to a large observation room. The room was filled with Zalorian diplomats and security officers. At the center of the room was a large, circular table. On one side of the table sat the Zalorian High Command. On the other side, the humans. I stood in the back trying to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. I watched the humans file in. There were about a dozen of them. Admiral Jameson was at the head of the delegation, leaning on his cane. Captain Sanchez was next to him, her face a mask of stoic professionalism. Behind them were a group of other officers and aides. They all looked unremarkable. They were just people. They didn't look like conquerors. They didn't look like gods. They just looked like tired, determined soldiers. The Zalorian High Command, on the other hand, was a sight to behold. The Grand Vexar himself was present. He was a massive, bloated creature, covered in ornate robes and ceremonial armor. He was flanked by the High Admiral of the fleet and the Minister of State. They all looked nervous. Their eyes darted around the room, and they kept glancing at the humans with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The meeting began with a formal exchange of pleasantries. The Grand Vexar offered his apologies for the misunderstanding. Admiral Jameson accepted the apology, but he made it clear that a formal apology was not enough. He wanted guarantees. He wanted assurances. He wanted the humans to be treated as equals. "We have no desire to conquer," Admiral Jameson said, his voice calm and steady. "We have no desire to expand. We simply want to be left alone. We want to have our sovereignty respected. We want to be treated as a member of the galactic community, not as a curiosity." The Grand Vexar nodded, his face ashen. "Of course," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Of course, we understand. We will make sure that all of our allies understand as well." "Good," Admiral Jameson said, "because if we are ever threatened again, we will not hesitate to use our weapons. We will not hesitate to defend ourselves. We will not be pushed around. Do I make myself clear?" The Grand Vexar swallowed hard. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you make yourself perfectly clear." The rest of the meeting was a blur of legal jargon and diplomatic posturing. The humans were firm, but they were not unreasonable. They didn't demand reparations or territory. They just demanded respect. They wanted to be treated as a sovereign power, with the right to defend their borders and protect their citizens. They wanted to be left alone. And they got what they wanted. The Galactic Council, terrified of the human weapons, agreed to all of their terms. The humans were granted a permanent seat on the council. They were given special dispensation to maintain their weapons, despite the Non-Proliferation Accord. They were given everything they asked for. But as I watched the proceedings, I realized that the humans didn't seem happy about it. There was no triumph in their eyes, no joy, just a deep, profound sadness. They had gotten what they wanted, but they had lost something in the process. They had been forced to remember what they were, and they didn't like it. After the meeting, I found myself walking through the corridors of the convergence. I didn't know where I was going. I was just walking, trying to process everything I had seen. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the figure approaching me until we almost collided. It was Captain Sanchez. She was alone, her eyes fixed on the floor. She looked up, startled, and then gave me a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't paying attention." I was stunned. She was speaking to me, a human, a captain. She was speaking to me like I was a person, not an enemy. It's fine," I stammered. "I wasn't paying attention either." She nodded and started to walk past me, but then she stopped. "You were at the demonstration," she said. "On the forward unto dawn. I saw you in the observation deck." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. She remembered me. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I was there." She looked at me, her eyes searching my face. "You looked scared," she said. I was scared. I had never been more scared in my life, but I didn't want to admit that to her. I said, my voice trembling. "I still am." She nodded, a strange look in her eyes. It was a look of sadness. "You should be," she said. "We are scary. We are a scary species. We've done terrible things. We've done things that would make your nightmares look like children's stories." She paused and I saw her jaw clench. "But we're also trying," she said. "We're trying to be better. We're trying to move past our history, but the galaxy won't let us. The galaxy keeps pushing us, keeps testing us, keeps forcing us to be the monsters we're trying to forget." She looked at me and her eyes were suddenly fierce. "We didn't want to show you that weapon," she said. "We didn't want to use it, but you left us no choice. You gave us no other option. You have to understand that." I didn't understand. I was too scared to understand, but I nodded anyway. "I understand," I lied. She looked at me for a long moment and then she sighed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry any of us had to see that." And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I watched her disappear around a corner, my mind reeling. I had just had a conversation with a human who had apologized to me, a human who had seemed almost sad. I made my way back to the shuttle, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and fear. I had seen the humans as monsters, and they were monsters, but they were also something else. They were victims, victims of their own history, victims of their own choices. They were trying to be better, but the galaxy wouldn't let them. When I returned to the vengeful star, the atmosphere was still heavy with tension, but something had changed. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a grudging respect. We had been beaten. We had been humiliated, but we had also been given a lesson that none of us would ever forget. The galaxy had learned a hard truth that day. The humans were not weak. They were not primitive. They were not a relic of the past. They were a force to be reckoned with, a force that had been asleep for 1,000 years and had just woken up. And as I looked out the window at the human ships, I couldn't help but think about Admiral Jameson's words. "We will never start a war, but we will always, always finish one." I believed him. I believed every word. We had made a terrible mistake. We had poked the bear. And now we had to live with the consequences. The humans were not our enemies. They were a force of nature, a force that was beyond our understanding, a force that would not be ignored. We had thought their ships belonged in a museum. We had laughed at their ancient designs. We had dismissed them as primitive and pathetic. We were wrong. The humans were not relics. They were guardians, guardians of their own past, guardians of their own future, and they would do whatever it took to protect what was theirs. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would I. I had seen the truth, and the truth was terrifying. They thought those human ships belonged in a museum. Then they started firing. And now we all knew the truth. The museum was a warning of what happens when you forget the past. A warning of what happens when you wake a sleeping giant. The humans had been asleep for 1,000 years. And now they were awake. And they were angry. They were not going back to sleep. And we were not going to forget.